The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years ago, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I had been out all day with my gun, and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east. The month, December. The place, a bleak, wide moor in the far north of England. And I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand, and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch, or fence, or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to move on, and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again, and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak, and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and, having spent out autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and of course very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that, with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell, and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on and on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I, too, must sleep the sleep of death? Death! I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me! How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart, but that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow." Then, folks do get cast away hereabouts fra time to time, and what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, my friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwolding?" "A good 20 mile, more or less." "And the nearest village?" The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 miles t'other side. Where do you live, then? Out yonder, said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. You're going home, I presume? Maybe I am. Then I'm going with you. The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. It ain't no use, growled he. He don't let you in, not he. We'll see about that, I replied briskly. Who is he? The master. Who is the master? That's naught to you, was the unceremonious reply. Well, well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight. You can try him, muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. Is this the house? I asked. Aye, it's the house, down bay, and he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked around with curiosity, and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served, apparently, a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with 4 sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping doth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude, movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument, and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. That's for you, said my guide, with a malicious grin. Yonder's his room. He pointed to a low, black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table, covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. Who are you? Said he. How came you here? What do you want? James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor. Meat, drink, and sleep. He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. Mine is not a house of entertainment, he said haughtily. Jacob, how dare you admit this stranger? I didn't admit him, grumbled the old man. He followed me over the muir, and shouldered his way in before me. I am no match for 6'2". And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house? The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning. The right of self-preservation. Self-preservation? There's an inch of snow on the ground already, I replied briefly, and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak. He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. It is true, he said. You can stay, if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper. With this he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel-shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair, it had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth, and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder." I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time I have not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long?" "Pray interrogate me," I replied. "I am heartily at your service." He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied as well as my slight information permitted. But the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and still leaning forward in the same moody attitude with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. From practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. By and by, I forget now by what link of conjecture or illustration, he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line or even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, spectres, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war, as against the belief in apparitions? And yet, what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men, in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands, and added, with an altered voice and manner, I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I too was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me, as I have forgotten the world. You have my history. It is a very sad one, I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. It is a very common one, he replied. I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me. He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window. It has ceased snowing, he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. Ceased, I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. Oh, if it were only possible, but no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight. Walk 20 miles tonight, repeated my host. What are you thinking of? Of my wife, I replied impatiently. Of my young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror. Where is she? At Dwolding, 20 miles away. At Dwolding, he echoed thoughtfully. Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles. But are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours? So very, very anxious, that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse. Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate, said he, smiling. The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwolding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor, and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one? Easily, gladly. He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and taking a bottle of whiskey and wine glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A glass of usquebaugh before you start?" I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help to keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality, and would have shaken hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute I had traversed the hall, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed, with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heel of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't fail of the way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" "Aye, 'tis the old coach road." "And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh upon 3 mile." I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road enough," said he, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parpet's broken away, close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, a good 50 feet and more, just at the worst bit o' road in the whole county." "Horrible! Were many lives lost?" "All. 4 were found dead, and t'other 2 died next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 year." "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." "Good night. Sit and thankee." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back by the way he had come. I watched the fight of his lantern till it quite disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer matter of the slightest difficulty, for, despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head, and accumulated them at compound interest. I did best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had but just been listening, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands, and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I were scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast, and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost, and could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up. The guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself of my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time I should have felt, and perhaps expressed, some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost my patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation, apparently, of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last state of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mold, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the 3rd passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair." He moved his head slowly, and looked me in the face without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He too was looking at me with the same startling pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own and saw, oh heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men like myself. A pale, phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you in half a dozen words the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach. End of The Phantom Coach.
The Tap by Arthur Edwards Chapman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Tap by Arthur Edwards Chapman. Mentally, I cursed the tap. If I had risen once to turn it off, I had risen half a dozen times during the last quarter of an hour, and still the disconcerting drip, drip, drip continued. This was my first night in a new flat, and after Mrs. Biggs, who came in to do the cleaning and prepare my meals, had wished me good night, I had settled down to run off a short article which I had promised to deliver by morning. The words had flowed from my pen with scarcely an effort, and probably for this very reason the incident stands out in my memory more vividly than would otherwise have been the case. I recollect that I had paused my writing to consider more deeply a certain point in my article. Glancing up at the clock, I had noticed the hands indicating 11:15, and as I took up my pen afresh, I heard that drip, drip, drip of the tap in the bathroom. For a few minutes I paid no attention to the sound and continued writing, but presently it became so loud and insistent that I found myself counting the drops unconsciously. Drip, drip, drip. A loose washer, I said to myself. I'll get a plumber tomorrow. Rising, I proceeded to the bathroom and turned the tap off so far as I was able. Then I went back to my desk, but barely had I picked up my pen than the sound recommenced. Drip, drip, drip. I tried to ignore it, but without success. The very quietness of the building seemed to intensify the noise until to listen to it became painful. I must have gone at least 4 times to try and screw the confounded thing off, and as surely as I returned to my chair, believing I had fixed it, just as surely would that dripping begin anew. With an exclamation of annoyance, I rose to my feet once more, and then suddenly I became aware that the drip, drip, drip was changing slowly, gradually, to a full rush of water, as though someone were turning on the tap to its fullest extent. In surprise, I hurried to the bathroom, and as I approached the door, I heard the little window blow open with a loud bang, and a great gust of air enfolded me, air of so icy a coldness that I shivered involuntarily. Grumbling at the carelessness of Mrs. Biggs in leaving the window unfastened, I closed it hastily and made it secure, shooting home the tiny bolt that a previous tenant had for some reason placed on the bottom frame. After stopping the tap, which by some strange freak had turned itself on, I closed the bathroom door and returned to my work with a renewed resolve to send for the plumber on the morrow. It was some time, however, before I was able fully to concentrate again, for I kept breaking off to listen for that drip, drip, drip. I listened in vain, for the tiresome sound was not renewed, and though I wrote for at least an hour longer, I did not hear it again that night. Next morning I put my resolve into practice, and in due course my friend the plumber arrived. After spending considerable time in the bathroom, he came in to report to me. "Didn't seem to be anything wrong, sir," he assured me, "but I've put a new washer on, and it'll be right enough now, sir. I'll bob in again, though, just to see it's going proper." Apparently he was right, for I did not hear the tap at all during the day. Once, after Mrs. Biggs had gone, I visited the bathroom to inspect the job, and was quite convinced that the dripping would not cause me further inconvenience. Also, I took the opportunity of seeing that the bathroom window was securely fastened, and thus satisfied, I returned to my study. I got thoroughly warmed up to my work and was totally oblivious to everything but the scratch of my pen as it sped across the smooth surface of the paper. All else seemed wrapped in a quietness like that of a tropical night, a quietness paradoxically emphasized by the multitude of familiar sounds that, strangely enough, fail to impress themselves upon one's mind solely by reason of their very insistence. The ticking of the clock on the wall before me, the falling of an occasional coal from the grate, these and other commonplace noises served only to heighten the deadly stillness of my room. Then, suddenly, as I wrote, I became conscious of a new sound, an accompaniment, it seemed, to the scratch of my pen. Drip, drip, drip. It pierced the silence like a rapier pierces a heart. It forced itself upon me, so harshly that I dropped my pen and stuffed my fingers into my ears to shut it out. As I did so, I raised my head and found myself gazing with a feeling akin to fear at the clock. It was exactly 11:15. For an instant I stared, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Was it merely coincidence, or was there something uncanny about the tap? 11:15. Slowly, fearfully, I turned my head toward the door, half expecting to see some awful apparition come gliding through. Then I laughed, somewhat nervously I must admit, at my childish dread, and got sharply to my feet. Hang it all, my nerves were all on edge. I was working too hard. A rest would do me good. Drip, drip, drip. Nothing strange about that, surely, I thought. I would have it out with my friend the plumber all the same. Meanwhile, I must try and check the dripping. As I entered the bathroom, the tap, seeming to protest against my interference, began to drip faster, and I reached out my hand to stop it. Then I felt a peculiar stinging, burning sensation of intense cold across the backs of my hands, as though someone were passing a piece of ice over them, and the knob of the tap began slowly to unscrew itself. It was weird, uncanny. I cannot adequately describe it. I tried to resist that unseen force, but was powerless against it. Nor could I withdraw my hands from the tap. They were numb with that fey coldness and pressed on by invisible fingers against the metal, while the screw slowly turned round and round before my very eyes, and the drip, drip became a swift dribble. And then an awful, nameless terror took possession of me. I strove to flee, but could not. I turned my head away, but some strange power impelled me to return my gaze to the tap that kept on slowly turning. My heart beat madly against my ribs. I was hot and cold alternately. I think I went mad and struggled wildly to escape that horrible influence. Then, as the screw reached its limit and the water gushed forth, the little window suddenly was flung open, and an icy blast met me and sent me staggering back against the wall. For a few minutes I leaned there, striving to steady my racked nerves and collect my scattered wits. But now all was still and quiet, save for the rushing of the water. Mechanically I crossed to the basin and turned the tap off, afterward closing and fastening the window. Now I was able to think more calmly and endeavored to probe the mystery of this strange happening. But try as I would, I could not explain it. I had always been a skeptic where spiritualism was concerned, and yet... The next day passed quite as usual, and though on several occasions I entered the bathroom, there was no indication of anything out of the ordinary about the place. The tap was behaving just as any self-respecting tap should. During the evening I received a visit from an old college chum, Ralph Greatrix. In the old days we had fought many a wordy battle on matters relating to psychic research, for Greatrix was a keen student of the subject, whereas I, as I have intimated, was openly a scoffer. Remembering thus, I took the opportunity of telling him of my experience of the previous night. When I had finished my tale, Greatrix was silent for a space. Then he turned and looked at me queerly and said, rather irrelevantly I thought, "Do you remember the Goldstone murder which created such a sensation some 6 months ago?" I said I had a slight recollection of the affair. A certain theatrical manager of the name of Goldstone had murdered his wife in a fit of jealousy, wasn't it? Yes, Greatrix agreed slowly. Well, the crime was committed in this flat. Now it was my turn to stare curiously. In this flat, I repeated, taking out my cigarette case and offering it to him. Greatrix nodded. Let me refresh your memory a little, he said, lighting up. This Goldstone was known to be insanely jealous of his young wife. It was said that he suspected her of being unduly interested in a certain actor who was then playing lead in Goldstone's company. Well, one night, a Sunday it was, Goldstone was returning to his flat when he passed the actor in the street. Immediately, Goldstone's jealousy was aroused. In his mind, there was but one explanation. His wife had taken advantage of his absence to receive her lover. Oh, I seem to remember that, I interrupted. It was proved afterwards that the actor had just left some friends further up the street in whose company he had been all the evening. Wasn't that it? Yes, you're right, Greatrix said, but Goldstone didn't know that. All he thought of was the supposed faithlessness of his wife. His previous suspicions seemed to be more than justified, and he entered the flat with murder in his heart. His wife was just retiring and had gone into the bathroom for a glass of water, which she was in the habit of taking last thing at night. She had just turned on the tap, mark this well, and was reaching for the glass when Goldstone burst in upon her. Greatrix paused and gazed into the fireplace. That would be some time just before 11, he said reflectively. Just before 11, I shot the question suddenly. That's the time the tap starts to drip. My friend nodded his head slowly and continued. She hadn't time to fill the glass before Goldstone had her by the throat. You know the rest. A policeman heard her scream and forced an entry, but it was too late. He finished speaking and bent to poke the dying fire into a last despairing flame. I gazed at him half doubtfully. Then you think, I began. I believe, he said deliberately, that the spirit of the dead woman is seeking to complete the action which the mind conceived, but the body was unable to carry out. You mean that the thought uppermost in the woman's mind when death overtook her was to obtain a glass of water, and that the spirit will not rest in peace until this thought becomes translated into action? Yes, he said, and then stopped short, listening intently. I had heard the sound also, and knew that the hour had come. Glancing quickly at the clock, I saw that it was 11:15, and, as the drip, drip, drip slowly became louder, I felt something of that fear of the previous night returning. Greatrix rose sharply and flung his half-consumed cigarette into the fireplace, a strange, far-off look in his eyes. Come, he said quietly, and I followed him, not without some misgivings, to the bathroom. As he pushed open the door, my eyes instinctively sought out the tap, and I saw that it was slowly turning. For an instant my friend watched in silence. Then suddenly he crossed to the basin, and taking a glass from the shelf above, held it under the tap, which now was running swiftly. Wonderingly, I watched him, shivering a little as I felt an icy wave pass by me. But Greatrix did not appear to notice anything, and placing the glass, now full, on the basin, he came quickly to my side. "Watch," he said simply. Together we gazed at that glass of water, and then with a shock I realized that it was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it began to float upward as though raised by an invisible hand. Fascinated, horrified, I watched the upward course, and I think I would have rushed forward had not my companion held me back with a warning arm. Higher the glass went, and that invisible hand began to tilt it, so that it seemed as if the contents must be spilled to the floor. No drop fell, however. Instead, I saw the water slowly disappearing, vanishing into the air until the last drop was gone. I felt my head throbbing, my heart began to race. I could stand it no longer, and with a cry I flung aside my friend's restraining hand and darted wildly forward. With a loud crash, the window burst open, and as I fell back before the fierceness of that inrush of air, the glass, freed from the invisible power, tumbled to the floor, where it shattered into 100 fragments. With an effort, I calmed myself and turned to Greatrix, who was still standing with his back against the wall, a vacant look in his eyes and a faint smile of understanding and relief on his lips. What was it?" I stammered. "What does it mean?" Quietly he answered as he turned toward me. "It means that the unexpressed thought has become an actuality. The spirit will trouble you no more." My friend the plumber came, as he had promised, to see how his job had gone on. "Well, sir," he said, "I dare bet as how that tap ain't dripping now, eh?" I smiled thoughtfully. "No," I replied slowly, "it doesn't drip, now." "I thought as how I'd fix it," he exclaimed with professional pride. "What I don't know about taps ain't worth wasting breath on." End of The Tap. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
There Shall Be No Misunderstanding by Hildegarde Hawthorne. Nonsense, Archie. Why won't you look at it from my point of view? There's no need of getting angry about the matter. It's simply— My dear girl, I see your point of view without any trouble at all. Of course, you've a perfect right to any opinion you choose to hold. I don't pretend to flatter myself that I should have any influence in getting you to change it. Archie! Well? You are absurd. Just because I don't agree with you, I'm to be accused of selfishness and obstinacy. If anyone is obstinate, it certainly isn't I. Very likely. Perhaps we'd better not talk of the matter any more. The two young people were seated on the veranda of a country house, charmingly embowered in creeping vines, and commanding a wide view of the Hudson and the mighty hills through which it winds. The summer air was full of the fragrance of new-mown hay, and the drowsy murmur of insects lulled the ear, while ever and anon a thrush by the brook rippled into mellow song. Everything spoke of peace, except the two in whose hearts, by right, the perfecting glory of love should have given the culminating touch, for the two were engaged. Yet it so happened that a dispute, trifling in itself, had become magnified and embittered, after the sad human way, until both the man and the girl were in a state where any moment might bring forth some act or word which the rest of their lives would be spent regretting. After Archie's last remark there was silence for several minutes. He leaned back in his chair and looked grimly down at the river, while Eileen, having turned from him with a swift movement, stared nervously across the hills and blinked the tears from her eyes. When she spoke, it was with a measured coldness, which hid the hurried beating of her heart. "If we have only been engaged a week, and have already found a topic on which we must be silent, for fear of quarrelling, I think there must be something wrong." "If you can say such a thing as that, Eileen, there surely is," replied her lover, hoarsely. Then, there's nothing to do but— She stopped abruptly and glanced at Archie, but he still stared at the river and scarcely seemed to have heard her. She sprang to her feet, and the angry colour dyed her cheeks. "I'm sorry I've been so slow to understand you, Archie," she exclaimed. "It's evident we are not suited to each other. The best we can do is to forget we've ever been engaged." Archie stood up and looked at her, pale as she was flushed. "Do you mean our engagement is broken?" he asked. "Here is your ring," and she tore it off and handed it to him. "If your love for me cannot stand a disagreement, Eileen, doubtless you are right." He looked at the ring, and then put it slowly into his pocket. Eileen turned away and began to arrange the magazines on a table. A moment or two passed. Then Archie, without another word, strode down the veranda steps, and mounting his horse, which stood hitched at the foot, galloped off. Eileen listened to the beat of the hoofs until they died away. Then she went slowly into the house and up to her room. She felt as though she were carrying a great weight, and almost staggered as she reached her door. Tears blinded her as she entered. The perfume of the roses he had brought her that morning sweetened the air. There stood his photograph, manly, handsome, with the smile in his eyes which she knew so well. "Archie, Archie, Archie!" she sobbed, and threw herself on the bed in a passion of tears. "How can it have happened? What was the matter with us? You know I love you, Archie. Yes, and I know you love me. And yet, if we had hated each other, we couldn't have been more cruel. Can't a love like ours cast out misunderstanding and vanity and selfishness? I would die gladly if my death could save him from any pain, and yet I cannot yield a worthless point to him who is more than the whole world to me. We didn't mean what we said, it wasn't we who were talking, and yet we have given each other a deadly wound, have insulted our love, have trampled a holy thing in the dust." The hours slipped by, and at last Eileen roused herself. She sat up, feeling absently at the fourth finger of her left hand. She started as she realized what she was looking for. "Even my little finger misses him," she whispered, with a pitiful smile. Behind the house a narrow, winding path made its way between the apple trees, and past a yellow field of rye, through a green wood, and over a brook by a pretty rustic bridge. Beyond that point it wandered on, with many a lovely turn, giving now and again an enchanting glimpse of the great river, until, a mile or more farther, it joined the highway. It had been the custom of the lovers to meet at the little bridge every evening, and then to saunter together along the path, and home by a short cut across the golf links. Eileen knew that the hour when she generally started for the trysting place was at hand. Knew, hesitated, and suddenly arose. "He won't be there tonight, and I think my heart will break, but I will go. I cannot stay away." The shadows were long under the apple trees as she walked out, and the robins fluted joyously. The evening seemed too lovely to belong to earth. Meant for heaven, it had somehow lost its way, and dropped, by a fortunate chance, on our world. As Eileen moved slowly along the fragrant path, seeing in the sky the wonderful, ever-changing shades of rose and green and purple, hearing music from 100 happy birds, breathing the balmy air, an indescribable peace came into her troubled heart. What though anger and misunderstanding lay behind? She knew it was all right now. Archie would be waiting for her, waiting with a look of perfect comprehension, and she would not even need to speak. But speak she would, as she never had before, to tell him how deep, how great her love was, and that never more should a shadow darken it. Never, never. The birds sang always more sweetly, and the wind among the branches made tender harmonies that chimed with the love in her heart. And now she passed the yellow grain, and now entered the woods, and there, indeed, midway on the bridge, where the sun sent a mellow gleam through the overarching branches, stood her lover awaiting her. A wave of happiness surged over her, taking her breath for an instant. She stopped, and then ran forward with hands outstretched, calling in a voice low but of piercing tenderness, "My dearest, I knew that I should find you. I knew you would be here. If you had not, I think I should have died." In a moment they were in each other's arms, and at his kiss, the last faint doubt or lingering veil of bitterness, if any there was, passed utterly out of Eileen's heart, and it seemed to her that in that moment, for the first time, she knew happiness, supreme, divine. "Have you waited long?" "Not long, love." "Archie, you forgive me." "I understand you, beloved, and what is real beside our love?" With their arms about each other they sauntered on down the path. The dying radiance of the sun made a glory about them, the trees whispered and swayed over their heads, and it seemed to Eileen as though she scarcely touched the ground. What indeed was real beside their love? These lovely things about her, these singing birds and fragrant flowers and murmuring leaves, they were only a sort of picture, a reflection of the happiness in her heart. As long as this beautiful happiness lasted, and well she knew that it could never end, so long, too, would this delightful, blossoming world surround them. It must always be glorious summer where they two were. "My beloved," said Archie, looking down at her with shining eyes, "is not such a union worth a sacrifice?" "It would be worth any sacrifice." He drew her closer. They had reached an open glade where a clear spring bubbled up inside a circle of rocks and trickled off in a series of tiny pools and streamlets, where birds bathed and fluttered. Moved by the same impulse, the lovers seated themselves on the grass beside this spring, and remained a while in silence, looking into the crystal depth of the water. Each saw therein the reflection of the other, and to Eileen it seemed that never before had she seen a loftier beauty than was now expressed by her lover's face. He seemed almost to emit light, and half startled, half smiling, she turned towards him. "Archie!" she cried, catching his hand in hers. "Let me feel you. I want to be sure you are real. In the pool there you hardly seem to belong to this world." Archie smiled and threw his arm about her. "There is only one real world," he replied, "and we both belong to that. But give me your hand. There is something missing from it that should be there." Eileen flushed and paled, holding out her left hand with a gesture almost tragic. "Yes, put it back," she whispered. "The best part of myself is lacking when that is not there." He slipped the ring back and kissed the slender fingers. "Never let it come off again. The circle is the symbol of our perfect union, and that stone, the shining sign of its immortality. "I shall always wear it," said Eileen, solemnly, as though she were pronouncing a vow. "Come, then, my beloved, the time approaches," said Archie, with a deep tenderness. "The time?" asked Eileen, dreamily, as they rose. Glancing again into the pool, she caught a last wavering reflection of her lover's features. Surely there was a starry gleam about his brows. They moved on together to what seemed like rhythmic harmony, albeit soundless as a dream. "The time, Archie? What time?" "You will know soon now. But remember, my darling, nothing can really part us. You know that." "I know it." They were nearing the end of the path, and only a short way beyond lay the high road. Suddenly, a great dread was born in Eileen's heart. She clung trembling to her lover. "Don't go on, Archie. I am afraid. Don't go on. It is so perfect here, like heaven. I cannot bear to leave it." Archie smiled, and the smile held so much of joy, and yet withal so tender a pity, that tears filled Eileen's eyes, even as she leaned against him with a sigh of perfect happiness. "It is indeed like heaven, little love," he said, in a voice as deep and musical as the murmur of great pines. "But we must go on. Do you not understand?" Eileen lifted her head slowly and looked into her lover's eyes. Long they gazed at each other, hand clasped in hand, heart against heart. "You see," said Archie at last. Eileen turned pale and paler, and her eyes grew dark with dread. "Not that, my love, not that," she whispered. "I cannot bear that. I cannot lose you now." "We belong to each other forever, but for a little while. It is the sacrifice." "It is the sacrifice." The men stumbled along awkwardly with their load, breathing heavily. Suddenly they saw a girl step out into the dusty highway. They halted abruptly, looking one at the other with white faces, and trying as best they might to hide from her eyes the nature of their burden. She came steadily towards them, however, and seeing this, they laid what they were carrying by the roadside, and one of them came towards the girl hastily. "Don't come any farther," he exclaimed. There's been an accident, and—" "I know," she answered, quietly, and stopped. Even in the fading light he could see she was deadly pale. Then she came on. "He is dead, I know. I must see him." They drew aside, one of them muttering as she passed. "It was his horse. It fell with him." End of There Shall Be No Misunderstanding by Hildegarde Hawthorne.
The Thing at Ghent by Henri de Balzac. A peculiar thing took place at Ghent while I was staying there. A lady 10 years a widow lay on her bed attacked by mortal sickness. The 3 heirs of collateral lineage were waiting for her last sigh. They did not leave her side, for fear that she would make a will in favor of the convent of Béguines, belonging to the town. The sick woman kept silent. She seemed dozing, and death appeared to overspread, very gradually, her mute and livid face. Can't you imagine those three relations sitting in silence through that winter midnight beside her bed? An old nurse is with them, and she shakes her head, and the doctor sees with anxiety that the sickness has reached its last stage, and holds his hat in one hand, and with the other makes a sign to the relations, as if to say to them, I have no more visits to make here. Amid the solemn silence of the room is heard a dull rustling of the snowstorm, which beats upon the shutters. For fear that the eyes of the dying woman might be dazzled by the light, the youngest of the heirs had fitted a shade to the candle, which stood near the bed, so that the circle of light scarcely reached the pillow of the death-bed, from which the sallow countenance of the sick woman stood out like the figure of Christ, imperfectly gilded, and fixed upon a cross of tarnished silver. The flickering rays shed by the blue flames of the crackling fire were therefore the sole light of this sombre chamber, where the denouement of a drama was just ending. A log suddenly rolled from the fire on to the floor, as if presaging some catastrophe. At the sound of it, the sick woman quickly rose to a sitting posture. She opened two eyes, clear as those of a cat, and all present eyed her in astonishment. She saw the log advance, and before anyone could check an unexpected movement which seemed prompted by a kind of delirium, she bounded from her bed, seized the tongs, and threw the coal back into the fireplace. The nurse, the doctor, and relations rushed to her assistance. They took the dying woman in their arms. They put her back in bed. She lay her head upon the pillow, and after a few minutes died, keeping her eyes fixed, even after her death, upon the plank in the floor which the burning brand had touched. Scarcely had the Countess von Ostrom expired, when the three co-heirs exchanged looks of suspicion, and thinking no more about their aunt, began to examine the mysterious floor. As they were Belgians, their calculations were as rapid as their glances. An agreement was made by 3 words, uttered in low voice, that none of them would leave the chamber. A servant was sent to fetch a carpenter. Their collateral hearts beat excitedly as they gathered around the treasured flooring, and watched their young apprentice give the first blow with his chisel. The plank was cut through. "My aunt made a sign," said the youngest of the heirs. "No, it was merely a quivering of the light that made it appear so," replied the eldest, who kept one eye on the treasure and the other on the corpse. The afflicted relations discovered, exactly on the spot where the brand had fallen, a certain object, artistically enveloped in a mass of plaster. "Proceed," said the eldest of the heirs. The chisel of the apprentice then brought to light a human head, and some odds and ends of clothing, from which they recognized the Count, whom all the town believed had died at Java, and whose loss had been bitterly deplored by his wife. The end of The Thing at Ghent, by Henri de Balzac. 3 and 1 are one, by Ambrose Bierce. In the year 1861, Bar Lassiter, a young man of 22, lived with his parents and an elderly sister near Carthage, Tennessee. The family were in somewhat humble circumstances, subsisting by cultivation of a small and not very fertile plantation. Owning no slaves, they were not rated among the best people of their neighborhood, but they were honest persons of good education, fairly well-mannered, and as respectable as any family could be, if uncredentialed by personal dominion over the sons and daughters of Ham. The elder Lassiter had that severity of manner that so frequently affirms an uncompromising devotion to duty, and conceals a warm and affectionate disposition. He was of the iron of which martyrs are made, but in the heart of the matrix had lurked a nobler metal, fusible at a milder heat, yet never coloring nor softening the hard exterior. By both heredity and environment, something of the man's inflexible character had touched the other members of the family. The Lassiter home, though not devoid of domestic affection, was a veritable citadel of duty, and duty, duty is as cruel as death. When the war came, it found in the family, as in so many others in the state, a divided sentiment. The young man was loyal to the Union, the others savagely hostile. This unhappy division begot an unsupportable domestic bitterness, and when the offending son and brother left home with an avowed purpose of joining the Federal army, not a hand was laid in him, not a word of farewell was spoken, not a good wish followed him out into the world, whither he might meet with such spirit as he might whatever fate awaited him. Making his way to Nashville, already occupied by the army of General Buell, he enlisted in the first organization that he found, a Kentucky regiment of cavalry, and in due time passed through all the stages of military evolution, from raw recruit to experienced trooper. A right good trooper he was, too, although in his oral narrative, from which this tale is made, there is no mention of that. The fact was learned from his surviving comrades, for Bart Lassiter has answered "Here" to the sergeant whose name is Death. 2 years after he had joined it, his regiment passed through the region whence he had come. The country thereabout had suffered severely from the ravages of war, having been occupied alternately and simultaneously by the belligerent forces, and the sanguinary struggle had occurred in the immediate vicinity of the Lassiter homestead. But of this the young trooper was not aware. Finding himself in camp near his home, he felt a natural longing to see his parents and sister, hoping that in them, as in him, the unnatural animosity of the period had been softened by time and separation. Obtaining a leave of absence, he set foot in the late summer afternoon, and soon after the rising of the full moon was walking up the gravel path leading to the dwelling in which he had been born. Soldiers in the war age rapidly, and in youth 2 years are a long time. Bar Lassiter felt himself an old man, and had almost expected to find the place in ruin and desolation. Nothing apparently was changed. At the sight of each dear and familiar object, he was profoundly affected. His heart beat audibly. His emotions nearly suffocated him. An ache was in his throat. Unconsciously he quickened his pace until he almost ran, his long shadow making grotesque efforts to keep its place beside him. The house was unlighted, and the door opened. As he approached and paused to recover control of himself, his father came out and stood bareheaded in the moonlight. "Father!" cried the young man, springing forward with outstretched hand. "Father!" The elder man looked him sternly in the face, stood a moment motionless, and without a word withdrew into the house. Bitterly disappointed, humiliated, unexpressibly hurt, and altogether unnerved, the soldier dropped into a rustic seat in deep dejection, supporting his head upon his trembling hand. But he would not have it so. He was too good a soldier to accept repulse as defeat. He rose and entered the house, passing directly to the sitting-room. It was dimly lighted by an uncurtained east window. On a low stool by the hearthside, the only article of furniture in place, sat his mother, staring into the fireplace, strewn with blackened embers and cold ash. He spoke to her, tenderly, interrogatively, and with hesitation, but she neither answered nor moved, nor seemed in any way surprised. True, there had been time for her husband to apprise her of their guilty son's return. He moved nearer, and was about to lay his hand upon her arm, when his sister entered from an adjoining room, looked him full in the face, passed him without a sign of recognition, and left the room by a door that was partly behind him. He had turned his head to watch her, but when she was gone his eyes again sought his mother. She too had left the place. Bar Lassiter strode to the door by which he had entered. The moonlight on the lawn was tremulous, as if the sward were a rippling sea. The trees and their black shadows shook as in a breeze. Blended with its borders, the gravel walk seemed unsteady and insecure to walk on. This young soldier knew the optical illusions produced by tears. He felt them on his cheek, and he saw them sparkle on the breast of his trooper's jacket. He left the house and made his way back to camp. The next day, with no very definite intention, with no dominant feeling that he would rightly have named, he again sought the spot. Within a half a mile of it, he met Bushrod Albro, a former playfellow and schoolmate, who greeted him warmly. "I'm going to visit my home," said the soldier. The other looked at him rather sharply and said nothing. "I know," continued Lassiter, "that my folks have not changed, but—" "There have been changes," Albro interrupted. "Everything changes. I'll go with you, if you don't mind. We can talk as we go." But Albro did not talk. Instead of a home, they found only fire-blackened foundations of stone, enclosing an area of compact ash pitted by rains. Lassiter's astonishment was extreme. "I could not find the right way to tell you," said Albro. "In the fight a year ago, your house was burned by a Federal shell." "And my family, where are they?" "In heaven, I hope. All were killed by the shell." The end of 3 and 1 are 1 by Ambrose Bierce. An Unbidden Guest, from 25 Ghost Stories, compiled and edited by W. Bob Holland. My cousins, Kate and Tom Howard, married at Trinity at Easter time, concluded to commence housekeeping by taking one of those delightfully expensive furnished, unfurnished cottages, with which the fashionable watering place of W abounds. From those rear windows one might almost take a plunge into the surf, the beach being at the back door. They went down quite early in May, being in a great hurry to try their domestic experiment, and, as the evenings were still cold, they spent them about the open fire, spooning. It was upon one of these nights, about 11 o'clock, that they were startled by a noise, as of some small object falling, soon followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, and then quiet reigned again supreme. At once Tom, poker in hand, boldly started in search of the burglar, followed by Kate, wildly clutching at his coat-tails, in a state of tremor. They looked upstairs, under the various beds, Kate suggesting that in novels they were always to be found there. The dining room was next explored, where all seemed well, and, lastly, the kitchen, where they found what was evidently a solution of the mystery. The burglar had entered by the back door, which was found to be unlocked and slightly ajar. The first excitement subsiding, they returned again to the dining room, where Tom, upon closer inspection, then discovered that one of a pair of quaint little pepper-pots, wedding gifts, was missing, and other small articles on the sideboard had been slightly disturbed. The next morning, when Kate mildly remonstrated with the queen of the kitchen for her carelessness, She received a shock by being told that it was her usual custom to leave the door open, so that it could be aisy convenient looky for the milkmaid. They parted with her, and a new maid was engaged, whose chief qualification for the place was that she was most faithful in the discharge of her duties, especially in locking up. While they mourned the loss of the pepper pot, it still seemed so trifling when they thought of that lovely repoussé salad bowl sent by Aunt Julia, which stood nearby, that nothing was said of the loss outside of the family, and the little household settled into its normal state once more of billing and cooing. About a fortnight later, Tom started out one night with an old fisherman, one of the natives and a local character, to indulge in that delightful pastime, so dear to the heart of man, known as eeling, and, as the night was dark, the eels were particularly sporty, so that it was well on toward the wee small hours when Tom at last returned to the cottage. He found all excitement within. Kate was in hysterics, and the new maid, also weeping, was industriously applying the camphor bottle to her mistress's nose. The burglar, or ghost as they had now decided, though windows and doors being found to be securely locked this time, had been abroad again, and had succeeded in purloining nothing. His royal ghostship had amused himself, apparently, by simply walking about. "Oh, Tom, he had on such heavy boots, and was so dreadfully bold about it," said Kate tearfully. From that time, Kate became nervous and refused to be left alone. Tom started whenever the door creaked, and the treasure departed hurriedly, saying, "Faith, the house is haunted, sure." After that, Kate spent her days in girl hunting, and her nights in answering shadowy advertisements that never materialized. They tried Irish, English, Dutch, and the heathen Chinese, with a sprinkling of colored ladies to vary the monotony. They seemed about to become famous throughout the length and breadth of the land as the family that changes help once a week, when they landed treasure number 2. Shortly after her advent, we were all asked down to W to help celebrate their happiness, and incidentally to christen the new dining set. We were not a little surprised to find Kate so pale, and Tom rather distrait. However, after a delightful dinner that should have filled with pleasure the most exacting bride, we adjourned to the piazza, leaving the men to the contemplation of their cigars. We were enthusiastic in our praise of the house, and congratulated Kate in securing such a prize, when, to our horror, she burst into tears and said, "Oh, girls, it's a dreadful place. It's haunted," and then tearfully proceeded with the details until we all felt creepy and suggested the parlor and lights. It was not long afterward that Kate discovered that Tom had also related the ghost story to the men that evening, to which Ned Harris had said laconically, "Rats," and Bob Shaw laughingly remarked, "Tom, old chap, you really shouldn't take your nightcap so strong." About the 1st of July the climax came. The ghost walked again, this time taking not only the remaining pepper pot, but also a silver salt cellar. Evidently he had a penchant for small articles, but unlike former times, everything on the sideboard was in the greatest disorder. Aunt Julia's salad bowl was found on the floor, and not far away the cheese dish, with its contents scattered about. This time one of the windows was found half open. A week later a note came to me from Kate, saying that she and Tom had gone to Saratoga to spend the remainder of the season with her mother. The following spring Tom received a note and parcel from Mr. B., the owner of the house at W., which read as follows: "Dear Mr. Howard, I send you by express 3 articles of silver, which my wife suggests may belong to you, as they are marked with your initials, namely, 2 silver pepper pots and a salt cellar. They were found the other day, during the process of spring house cleaning, in a rat hole behind the sideboard. I forgot to have the holes stopped up last spring, or to caution you against the water rats. The great fellows will get in, you know. Kind regards to Mrs. Howard. Yours truly, John B. The next season the Ghost Club was organized, the badge being a small silver rat, bearing proudly aloft a tiny pepper pot. We thoughtfully offered Tom the presidency, but he declined, with offended dignity, from the effects of which I think he will never fully recover. The End of The Unbidden Ghost by W. Bob Holland.
Part 1 of Wake Not the Dead. Wilt thou forever sleep? Wilt thou never more awake, my beloved, but henceforth repose forever from thy short pilgrimage on earth? Oh, yet once again return, and bring back with thee the vivifying dawn of hope to one whose existence hath, since thy departure, been obscured by the dunnest shades. What? Dumb? Forever dumb? Thy friend lamenteth, and thou heedest him not. He sheds bitter, scalding tears, and thou reposest unregarding his affliction. He is in despair, and thou no longer openest thy arms to him as an asylum from his grief? Say then, doth the paly shroud become thee better than the bridal veil? Is the chamber of the grave a warmer bed than the couch of love? Is the spectre death more welcome to thy arms than thy enamoured consort? Oh, return, my beloved, return once again to this anxious, disconsolate bosom. Such were the lamentations which Walter poured forth for his Brünnhilde, the partner of his youthful, passionate love. Thus did he bewail over her grave at the midnight hour, what time the spirit that presides in the troublous atmosphere sends his legions of monsters through mid-air, so that their shadows, as they flit beneath the moon and across the earth, dart as wild, agitating thoughts that chase each other o'er the sinner's bosom. Thus did he lament under the tall linden trees by her grave, while his head reclined on the cold stone. Walter was a powerful lord in Burgundy, who in his earliest youth had been smitten with the charms of the fair Brünnhilde, a beauty far surpassing in loveliness all her rivals. For her tresses, dark as the raven face of night, streaming over her shoulders, set off to the utmost advantage the beaming lustre of her slender form, and the rich dye of a cheek whose tint was deep and brilliant as that of the western heaven. Her eyes did not resemble those burning orbs whose pale glow gems the vault of night, and whose immeasurable distance fills the soul with deep thoughts of eternity, but rather as the sober beams which cheer this nether world, and which, while they enlighten, kindle the sons of earth to joy and love. Brünnhilde became the wife of Walter, and both being equally enamored and devoted, they abandoned themselves to the enjoyment of a passion that rendered them reckless of aught besides, while it lulled them in a fascinating dream. Their sole apprehension was lest aught should awaken them from a delirium which they prayed might continue forever. Yet how vain is the wish that would arrest the decrees of destiny! As well might it seek to divert the circling planets from their eternal course. Short was the duration of this frenzied passion. Not that it gradually decayed and subsided into apathy, but death snatched away his blooming victim, and left Walter to a widowed couch. Impetuous, however, as was his first burst of grief, he was not inconsolable, for ere long another bride became the partner of the youthful nobleman. Svanhilde also was beautiful, although nature had formed her charms on a very different model from those of Brunhilde. Her golden locks waved bright as the beams of morn. Only when excited by some emotion of her soul did a rosy hue tinge the lily paleness of her cheek. Her limbs were proportioned in the nicest symmetry, yet did they not possess that luxuriant fullness of animal life. Her eye beamed eloquently, but it was with the milder radiance of a star, tranquilizing to tenderness, rather than exciting to warmth. Thus formed, it was not possible that she should steep him in his former delirium, although she rendered happy his waking hours, tranquil and serious, yet cheerful, studying in all things her husband's pleasure. She restored order and comfort in his family, where her presence shed a general influence all around. Her mild benevolence tended to restrain the fiery, impetuous disposition of Walter, while at the same time her prudence recalled him in some degree from his vain, turbulent wishes, and his aspirings after unattainable enjoyments, to the duties and pleasures of actual life. Svanhilde bore her husband 2 children, a son and a daughter. The latter was mild and patient as her mother, well contented with her solitary sports, and even in these recreations displayed the serious turn of her character. The boy possessed his father's fiery, restless disposition, tempered, however, with the solidity of his mother. Attached by his offspring more tenderly towards their mother, Walter now lived for several years very happily. His thoughts would frequently indeed recur to Brunhilde, but without their former violence, merely as we dwell upon the memory of a friend of our earlier days, borne from us on the rapid current of time, to a region where we know that he is happy. But clouds dissolve into air, flowers fade, the sands of the hourglass run imperceptibly away, and even so do human feelings dissolve, fade, and pass away, and with them too, human happiness. Walter's inconstant breast again sighed for the ecstatic dreams of those days which he had spent with his equally romantic, enamored Brunhilde. Again did she present herself to his ardent fancy in all the glow of her bridal charms, and he began to draw a parallel between the past and the present. Nor did imagination, as it is wont, fail to array the former in her brightest hues, while it proportionably obscured the latter, so that he pictured to himself the one much more rich in enjoyment, and the other much less so than they really were. This change in her husband did not escape Svanhilde, whereupon, redoubling her attentions towards him and her cares towards their children, she expected by this means to reunite the knot that was slackened. Yet, the more she endeavored to regain his affections, the colder did he grow, the more intolerable did her caresses seem, and the more continually did the image of Brunhilde haunt his thoughts. The children, whose endearments were now become indispensable to him, alone stood between the parents, as genii eager to effect a reconciliation, and, beloved by them both, formed a uniting link between them. Yet, as evil can be plucked from the heart of man only ere its root has yet struck deep, its fangs being afterwards too firm to be eradicated, so was Walter's diseased fancy too far affected to have its disorder stopped. For in a short time it completely tyrannized over him. Frequently, of a night, instead of retiring to his consort's chamber, he repaired to Brunhilde's grave, where he murmured forth his discontent, saying, "Wilt thou sleep forever?" One night, as he was reclining on the turf, indulging in his wonted sorrow, a sorcerer from the neighboring mountains entered into this field of death for the purpose of gathering for his mystic spells such herbs as grow only from the earth wherein the dead repose, and which, as if the last production of mortality, are gifted with a powerful and supernatural influence. The sorcerer perceived the mourner and approached the spot where he was lying. "Wherefore, fond wretch, dost thou grieve thus for what is now a hideous mass of mortality, mere bones and nerves and veins? Nations have fallen unlamented, even worlds themselves, long ere this globe of ours was created, have mouldered into nothing, nor hath anyone wept over them. Why then shouldst thou indulge this vain affliction for a child of the dust, a being as frail as thyself, and, like thee, the creature but of a moment?" Walter raised himself up. "Let yon worlds that shine in the firmament," replied he, "lament for each other as they perish. It is true that I, who am myself clay, lament for my fellow clay. Yet is this clay impregnated with a fire, with an essence that none of the elements of creation possess, with love. And this divine passion I felt for her who now sleepeth beneath this sod." "Will thy complaints awaken her? Or could they do so, would she not soon upbraid thee for having disturbed that repose in which she is now hushed?" "Avaunt, cold-hearted being! Thou knowest not what is love. Oh, that my tears could wash away the earthy covering that conceals her from these eyes, that my groan of anguish could rouse her from her slumber of death. No, she would not again seek her earthy couch." "Insensate that thou art, and couldst thou endure to gaze without shuddering on one disgorged from the jaws of the grave? Art thou too thyself the same from whom she parted? Or hath time passed o'er thy brow and left no traces there? Would not thy love rather be converted into hate and disgust? Say rather that the stars would leave yon firmament, that the sun will henceforth refuse to shed his beams through the heavens. Oh, that she stood once more before me, that once again she reposed on this bosom. How quickly should we then forget that death or time had ever stepped between us. Delusion, mere delusion of the brain, from heated blood, like to that which arises from the fumes of wine. It is not my wish to tempt thee, to restore to thee thy dead, else wouldst thou soon feel that I have spoken truth." "How restore her to me?" exclaimed Walter, casting himself at the sorcerer's feet. "Oh, if thou art indeed able to effect that, grant it to my earnest supplication. If one throb of human feeling vibrates in thy bosom, let my tears prevail with thee. Restore to me my beloved. So shalt thou hereafter bless the deed, and see that it was a good work. A good work? A blessed deed? Returned the sorcerer with a smile of scorn. For me there exists nor good nor evil, since my will is always the same. Ye alone know evil, who will that which ye would not. It is indeed in my power to restore her to thee. Yet bethink thee well, whether it will prove thy weal. Consider, too, how deep the abyss between life and death. Across this my power can build a bridge, but it can never fill up the frightful chasm. Walter would have spoken, and have sought to prevail on this powerful being by fresh entreaties, but the latter prevented him, saying, Peace, bethink thee well, and return hither to me tomorrow at midnight. Yet once more do I warn thee, wake not the dead. Having uttered these words, the mysterious being disappeared. Intoxicated with fresh hope, Walter found no sleep on his couch, for fancy, prodigal of her richest stores, expanded before him the glittering web of futurity. And his eye, moistened with the dew of rapture, glanced from one vision of happiness to another. During the next day he wandered through the woods, lest wanted objects, by recalling the memory of later and less happier times, might disturb the blissful idea that he should again behold her, again fold her in his arms, gaze on her beaming brow by day, repose on her bosom at night. And as this sole idea filled his imagination, how was it possible that the least doubt should arise, or that the warning of the mysterious old man should recur to his thoughts? No sooner did the midnight hour approach than he hastened before the grave field, where the sorcerer was already standing by that of Brunhilde. Hast thou maturely considered? Inquired he. Oh, restore to me the object of my ardent passion, exclaimed Walter with impetuous eagerness. Delay not thy generous action, lest I die even this night, consumed with disappointed desire, and behold her face no more. Well then, answered the old man, return hither again tomorrow at the same hour. But once more do I give thee this friendly warning. Wake not the dead. All in the despair of impatience, Walter would have prostrated himself at his feet and supplicated him to fulfill at once a desire now increased to agony. But the sorcerer had already disappeared. Pouring forth his lamentations more wildly and impetuously than ever, he lay upon the grave of his adored one, until the grey dawn streaked the east. During the day, which seemed to him longer than any he had ever experienced, he wandered to and fro, restless and impatient, seemingly without any object, and deeply buried in his own reflections, in quest as the murderer who meditates his first deed of blood. And the stars of evening found him once more at the appointed spot. At midnight, the sorcerer was there also. Hast thou yet maturely deliberated? Inquired he, as on the preceding night? Oh, what should I deliberate? Returned Walter impatiently. I need not to deliberate. What I demand of thee is that which thou hast promised me, that which will prove my bliss. Or dost thou but mock me? If so, hence from my sight, lest I be tempted to lay my hand on thee. Once more do I warn thee, answered the old man with undisturbed composure. Wake not the dead. Let her rest. Ay, but not in the cold grave. She shall rather rest on this bosom, which burns with eagerness to clasp her. Reflect. Thou mayst not quit her until death, even though aversion and horror should seize thy heart. There would then remain only one horrible means. Dotard, cried Walter, interrupting him. How may I hate that which I love with such intensity of passion? How should I abhor that for which my every drop of blood is boiling? Then be it even as thou wishest, answered the sorcerer. Step back. The old man now drew a circle round the grave, all the while muttering words of enchantment. Immediately, the storm began to howl among the tops of the trees. Owls flapped their wings and uttered their low voice of omen. The stars hid their mild, beaming aspect, that they might not behold so unholy and impious a spectacle. The stone then rolled from the grave with a hollow sound, leaving a free passage for the inhabitant of that dreadful tenement. The sorcerer scattered into the yawning earth roots and herbs of most magic power and of most penetrating odor, so that the worms, crawling forth from the earth, congregated together and raised themselves in a fiery column over the grave, while rushing wind burst from the earth, scattering the mold before it, until at length the coffin lay uncovered. The moonbeams fell on it, and the lid burst open with a tremendous sound. Upon this, the sorcerer poured upon it some blood from out of a human skull, exclaiming at the same time, Drink, sleeper, of this warm stream, that thy heart may again beat within thy bosom. And after a short pause, shedding on her some other mystic liquid, he cried aloud with the voice of one inspired, Yes, thy heart beats once more with the flood of life. Thine eye is again opened to sight. Arise, therefore, from the tomb. As an island suddenly springs forth from the dark waves of the ocean, raised upwards from the deep by the force of subterraneous fires, so did Brunhilde start from her earthy couch, borne forward by some invisible power. Taking her by the hand, the sorcerer led her towards Walter, who stood at some little distance, rooted to the ground with amazement. Receive again, said he, the object of thy passionate sighs. Mayest thou never more require my aid. Should that, however, happen, so wilt thou find me, during the full of the moon, upon the mountains, in that spot, and where the 3 roads meet." Instantly did Walter recognize, in the form that stood before him, her whom he so ardently loved, and a sudden glow shot through his frame at finding her thus restored to him. Yet the night frost had chilled his limbs and palsied his tongue. For a while he gazed upon her without either motion or speech, and during this pause all was again become hushed and serene, and the stars shone brightly in the clear heavens. "Walter!" exclaimed the figure, and at once the well-known sound, thrilling to his heart, broke the spell by which he was bound. "Is it reality? Is it truth?" cried he, "or a cheating delusion?" "No, it is no imposture. I am really living. Conduct me quickly to thy castle in the mountains." Walter looked around. The old man had disappeared, but he perceived, close by his side, a coal-black steed of fiery eye, ready equipped to conduct him thence. And on his back lay all proper attire for Brunhilde, who lost no time in arraying herself. This being done, she cried, "Haste, let us away ere the dawn breaks, for my eye is yet too weak to endure the light of day." Fully recovered from his stupor, Walter leapt into his saddle, and, catching up with a mingled feeling of delight and awe the beloved being, thus mysteriously restored from the power of the grave, he spurred on, across the wild, towards the mountains, as furiously as if pursued by the shadows of the dead, hastening to recover from him their sister. The castle to which Walter conducted his Brunhilde was situated on a rock between other rocks rising up above it. Here they arrived, unseen by any, save one aged domestic, on whom Walter imposed secrecy by the severest threats. "Here will we tarry," said Brunhilde, "until I can endure the light, and until thou canst look upon me without trembling, as if struck with a cold chill." They accordingly continued to make that place their abode. Yet no one knew that Brunhilde existed, save only that aged attendant who provided their meals. During 7 entire days they had no light except that of tapers. During the next 7, the light was admitted through the lofty casements, only while the rising or setting sun faintly illumined the mountain tops, the valley being still enveloped in shade. Seldom did Walter quit Brunhilde's side. A nameless spell seemed to attach him to her. Even the shudder which he felt in her presence, and which would not permit him to touch her, was not unmixed with pleasure, like that thrilling, awful emotion felt when strains of sacred music float under the vault of some temple. He rather sought, therefore, than avoided this feeling. Often, too, as he had indulged in calling to mind the beauties of Brunhilde, she had never appeared so fair, so fascinating, so admirable, when depicted by his imagination, as when now beheld in reality. Never, till now, had her voice sounded with such tones of sweetness. Never before did her language possess such eloquence as it now did, when she conversed with him on the subject of the past. And this was the magic fairyland towards which her words constantly conducted him. Ever did she dwell upon the days of their first love, those hours of delight in which they had participated together, when the one derived all enjoyment from the other. And so rapturous, so enchanting, so full of life did she recall to his imagination that blissful season, that he even doubted whether he had ever experienced with her so much felicity, or had been so truly happy. And while she thus vividly portrayed their hours of past delight, she delineated in still more glowing, more enchanting colors those hours of approaching bliss which now awaited them, richer in enjoyment than any preceding ones. In this manner did she charm her attentive auditor with enrapturing hopes for the future, and lull him into dreams of more than mortal ecstasy, so that while he listened to her siren strain, he entirely forgot how little blissful was the latter period of their union, when he had often sighed at her imperiousness and at her harshness, both to himself and all his household. Yet, even had he recalled this to mind, would it have disturbed him in his present delirious trance? Had she not now left behind in the grave all the frailty of mortality? Was not her whole being refined and purified by that long sleep, in which neither passion nor sin had approached her, even in dreams? How different now was the subject of her discourse! Only when speaking of her affection for him did she betray anything of earthly feeling. At other times, she uniformly dwelt upon themes relating to the invisible and future world. When, in descanting and declaring the mysteries of eternity, a stream of prophetic eloquence would burst from her lips. In this manner had twice 7 days elapsed, and, for the first time, Walter beheld the being, now dearer to him than ever, in the full light of day. Every trace of the grave had disappeared from her countenance. A roseate tinge, like the ruddy streaks of dawn, again beamed on her pallid cheek. The faint, mouldering taint of the grave was changed into a delightful violet scent, the only sign of earth that never disappeared. He no longer felt either apprehension or awe as he gazed upon her in the sunny light of day. It was not until now that he seemed to have recovered her completely, and, glowing with all his former passion towards her, he would have pressed her to his bosom. But she gently repulsed him, saying, "Not yet. Spare your caresses until the moon has again filled her horn." Spite of his impatience, Walter was obliged to await the lapse of another period of 7 days. But on the night when the moon was arrived at the full, he hastened to Brunhilde, whom he found more lovely than she had ever appeared before. Fearing no obstacles to his transports, he embraced with all the fervor of a deeply enamored and successful lover. Brunhilde, however, still refused to yield to his passion. "What?" exclaimed she. "Is it fitting that I, who have been purified by death from the frailty of mortality, should become thy concubine? while a mere daughter of the earth bears the title of thy wife? Never shall it be. No, it must be within the walls of thy palace, within that chamber where I once reigned as queen, that thou obtainest the end of thy wishes, and of mine also," added she, imprinting a glowing kiss on the lips, and immediately disappeared. Heated with passion and determined to sacrifice everything to the accomplishment of his desires, Walter hastily quitted the apartment, and shortly after, the castle itself. He travelled over mountain and across heath with the rapidity of a storm, so that the turf was flung up by his horse's hoofs, nor once stopped till he arrived home. Here, however, neither the affectionate caresses of Svanhilda or those of his children could touch his heart, or induce him to restrain his furious desires. Alas! Is the impetuous torrent to be checked in its devastating course by the beauteous flowers over which it rushes, when they exclaim, "Destroyer! Commiserate our helpless innocence and beauty, nor lay us waste." The stream sweeps over them unregarding, and a single moment annihilates the pride of a whole summer. Shortly afterwards did Walter begin to hint to Svanhilda that they were ill-suited to each other, that he was anxious to taste that wild, tumultuous life so well according with the spirit of his sex, while she, on the contrary, was satisfied with the monotonous circle of household enjoyments, that he was eager for whatever promised novelty, while she felt most attached to what was familiarized to her by habit, and lastly, that her cold disposition, bordering upon indifference, but ill assorted with his ardent temperament. It was, therefore, more prudent that they should seek, apart from each other, that happiness which they could not find together. A sigh and a brief acquiescence in his wishes was all the reply that Svanhilda made. And, on the following morning, upon his presenting her with a paper of separation, informing her that she was at liberty to return home to her father, she received it most submissively. Yet, ere she departed, she gave him the following warning: "Too well do I conjecture to whom I am indebted for this our separation. Often have I seen thee at Brunhilda's grave, and beheld thee there even on that night when the face of the heavens was suddenly enveloped in a veil of clouds. Hast thou rashly dared to tear aside the awful veil that separates the mortality that dreams from that which dreameth not? Oh, then woe to thee, thou wretched man, for thou hast attached to thyself that which will prove thy destruction." She ceased, nor did Walter attempt any reply, for the similar admonition, uttered by the sorcerer, flashed upon his mind, all obscured as it was by passion, just as the lightning glares momentarily through the gloom of night without dispersing the obscurity. Svanhilda then departed in order to pronounce to her children a bitter farewell, for they, according to national custom, belonged to the father. And, having bathed them in her tears, and consecrated them with the holy water of maternal love, she quitted her husband's residence and departed to the home of her fathers. End of Part 1 of Wake Not the Dead. Part 2 of Wake Not the Dead. Thus was the kind and benevolent Svanhilda driven an exile from those halls, where she had presided with grace, from halls which were now newly decorated to receive another mistress. The day at length arrived, on which Walter, for the second time, conducted Brunhilde home as a newly made bride. And he caused it to be reported among his domestics that his new consort had gained his affections by her extraordinary likeness to Brunhilde, their former mistress. How ineffably happy did he deem himself as he conducted his beloved once more into the chamber which had often witnessed their former joys, and which was now newly gilded and adorned in a most costly style. Among the other decorations were figures of angels scattering roses, which served to support the purple draperies, whose ample folds o'ershadowed the nuptial couch. With what impatience did he await the hour that was to put him in possession of those beauties, for which he had already paid so high a price, but whose enjoyment was to cost him most dearly yet. Unfortunate Walter, revelling in bliss, thou beholdest not the abyss that yawns beneath thy feet. Intoxicated with the luscious perfume of the flower thou hast plucked, thou little deemest how deadly is the venom with which it is fraught, although for a short season its potent fragrance bestows new energy on all thy feelings. Happy, however, as Walter was now, his household were far from being equally so. The strange resemblance between their new lady and the deceased Brunhilde filled them with a secret dismay, an undefinable horror, for there was not a single difference of feature, of tone of voice, or of gesture. To add, too, to these mysterious circumstances, her female attendants discovered a particular mark on her back, exactly like one which Brunhilde had. A report was now soon circulated that their lady was no other than Brunhilde herself, who had been recalled to life by the power of necromancy. How truly horrible was the idea of living under the same roof with one who had been an inhabitant of the tomb, and of being obliged to attend upon her and acknowledge her as mistress. There was also in Brunhilde much to increase this aversion and favor their superstition. No ornaments of gold ever decked her person. All that others were wont to wear of this metal she had formed of silver. No richly colored and sparkling jewels glittered upon her. Pearls alone lent their pale luster to adorn her bosom. Most carefully did she always avoid the cheerful light of the sun, and was wont to spend the brightest days in the most retired and gloomy apartments. Only during the twilight of the commencing or declining day did she ever walk abroad. But her favorite hour was when the phantom light of the moon bestowed on all objects a shadowy appearance and a sombre hue. Always, too, at the crowing of the cock, an involuntary shudder was observed to seize her limbs. Imperious as before her death, she quickly imposed her iron yoke on every one around her, while she seemed even far more terrible than ever, since a dread of some supernatural power attached to her appalled all who approached her. A malignant, withering glance seemed to shoot from her eye on the unhappy object of her wrath, as if it would annihilate its victim. In short, those halls which in the time of Svanhilda were the residence of cheerfulness and mirth, now resembled an extensive desert tomb. With fear imprinted on their pale countenances, the domestics glided through the apartments of the castle, and in this abode of terror, the crowing of the cock caused the living to tremble, as if they were the spirits of the departed, for the sound always reminded them of their mysterious mistress. There was no one but who shuddered at meeting her in a lonely place, in the dusk of evening, or by the light of the moon, a circumstance that was deemed to be ominous of some evil. So great was the apprehension of her female attendants, they pined in continual disquietude, and by degrees all quitted her. In the course of time, even others of the domestics fled, for an insupportable horror had seized them. The art of the sorcerer had, indeed, bestowed upon Brunhilde an artificial life, and due nourishment had continued to support the restored body. Yet this body was not able of itself to keep up the genial glow of vitality and to nourish the flame, whence springs all the affections and passions, whether of love or hate. For death had forever destroyed and withered it. All that Brunhilde now possessed was a chilled existence, colder than that of the snake. It was, nevertheless, necessary that she should love and return with equal ardor the warm caresses of her spell-enthralled husband, to whose passion alone she was indebted for her renewed existence. It was necessary that a magic draught should animate the dull current in her veins and awaken her to the glow of life and the flame of love. A potion of abomination, one not even to be named without a curse. Human blood, imbibed whilst yet warm from the veins of youth. This was the hellish drink for which she thirsted, possessing no sympathy with the purer feelings of humanity, deriving no enjoyment from aught that interests in life and occupies its varied hours. Her existence was a mere blank, unless when in the arms of her paramour husband, and therefore was it that she craved incessantly after the horrible draught. It was even with the utmost effort that she could forbear sucking even the blood of Walter himself, reclined beside her. Whenever she beheld some innocent child, whose lovely face denoted the exuberance of infantine health and vigor, she would entice it, by soothing words and fond caresses, into her most secret apartment, where, lulling it to sleep in her arms, she would suck from its bosom the warm purple tide of life. Nor were youths of either sex safe from her horrid attack. Having first breathed upon her unhappy victim, who never failed immediately to seek into a lengthened sleep, she would then, in a similar manner, drain his veins of the vital juice. Thus, children, youths, and maidens quickly faded away, as flowers gnawn by the cankering worm. The fullness of their limbs disappeared. A sallow line succeeded to the rosy freshness of their cheeks. The liquid luster of the eye was deadened, even as the sparkling stream when arrested by the touch of frost, and their locks became thin and grey, as if already ravaged by the storm of life. Parents beheld with horror this desolating pestilence devouring their offspring, nor could simple or charm, potion or amulet avail aught against it. The grave swallowed up one after the other. Or, did the miserable victim survive, he became cadaverous and wrinkled, even in the very morn of existence. Parents observed with horror this devastating pestilence snatch away their offspring, a pestilence which nor herb, however potent, nor charm, nor holy taper, nor exorcism could avert. They either beheld their children sink, one after the other, into the grave, or their youthful forms, withered by the unholy vampire embrace of Brunhilde, assumed the decrepitude of sudden age. At length, strange surmises and reports began to prevail. It was whispered that Brunhilde herself was the cause of all these horrors, although no one could pretend to tell in what manner she destroyed her victims, since no marks of violence were discernible. Yet, when young children confessed that she had frequently lulled them asleep in her arms, and elder ones said that a sudden slumber had come upon them whenever she began to converse with them, suspicion became converted into certainty, and those whose offspring had hitherto escaped unharmed quitted their hearths and home, all their little possessions, the dwellings of their fathers, and the inheritance of their children, in order to rescue from so horrible a fate those who were dearer to their simple affections than aught else the world could give. Thus, daily did the castle assume a more desolate appearance. Daily did its environs become more deserted. None but a few aged, decrepit old women and grey-headed menials were to be seen remaining of the once numerous retinue. Such will, in the latter days of the earth, be the last generation of mortals, when childbearing shall have ceased, when youth shall no more be seen, nor any arise to replace those who shall await their fate in silence. Walter alone noticed not or heeded not the desolation around him. He apprehended not death, lapped as he was in a glowing elysium of love. Far more happy than formerly did he now seem in the possession of Brunhilde. All those caprices and frowns which had been wont to overcloud their former union had now entirely disappeared. She even seemed to dote on him with a warmth of passion that she had never exhibited, even during the happy season of bridal love. For the flame of that youthful blood, of which she drained the veins of others, rioted in her own. At night, as soon as he closed his eyes, she would breathe on him till he sank into delicious dreams, from which he awoke only to experience more rapturous enjoyments. By day, she would continually discourse with him on the bliss experienced by happy spirits beyond the grave, assuring him that, as his affection had recalled her from the tomb, they were now irrevocably united. Thus fascinated by a continual spell, it was not possible that he should perceive what was taking place around him. Brunhilde, however, foresaw with savage grief that the source of her youthful ardor was daily decreasing, for in a short time there remained nothing gifted with youth, save Walter and his children. And these latter, she resolved, should be her next victims. On her first return to the castle, she had felt an aversion towards the offspring of another, and therefore abandoned them entirely to the attendants appointed by Svanhilda. Now, however, she began to pay considerable attention to them, and caused them to be frequently admitted into her presence. The aged nurses were filled with dread at perceiving these marks of regard from her towards their young charges. Yet dared they not to oppose the will of their terrible and imperious mistress. Soon did Brunhilde gain the affection of the children, who were too unsuspecting of guile to apprehend any danger from her. On the contrary, her caresses won them completely to her. Instead of ever checking their mirthful gambols, she would rather instruct them in new sports. Often, too, did she recite to them tales of such strange and wild interest as to exceed all the stories of their nurses. Were they wearied either with play or with listening to her narratives, she would take them on her knees and lull them to slumber. Then did visions of the most surpassing magnificence attend their dreams. They would fancy themselves in some garden where flowers of every hue rose, in rows one above the other, from the humble violet to the tall sunflower, forming a parti-coloured broidery of every hue, sloping upwards towards the golden clouds, where little angels whose wings sparkled with azure and gold descended to bring them delicious cakes or splendid jewels, or sung to them soothing melodious hymns. So delightful did these dreams in short time become to the children, that they longed for nothing so eagerly as to slumber on Brunhilde's lap, for never did they else enjoy such visions of heavenly forms. They were the most anxious for that which was to prove their destruction. Yet do we not all aspire after that which conducts us to the grave, after the enjoyment of life? These innocents stretched out their arms to approaching death, because it assumed the mask of pleasure, for which they were lapped in these ecstatic slumbers. Brunhilde sucked the life stream from their bosoms. On waking, indeed, they felt themselves faint and exhausted, yet did no pain nor any mark betray the cause. Shortly, however, did their strength entirely fail, even as the summer brook is gradually dried up. Their sports became less and less noisy. Their loud, frolicsome laughter was converted into a faint smile. The full tones of their voices died away into a mere whisper. Their attendants were filled with horror and despair. Too well did they conjecture the horrible truth, yet dared not to impart their suspicions to Walter, who was so devotedly attached to his horrible partner. Death had already smote his prey. The children were but the mere shadows of their former selves, and even this shadow quickly disappeared. The anguished father deeply bemoaned their loss, for, notwithstanding his apparent neglect, he was strongly attached to them. Nor until he had experienced their loss was he aware that his love was so great. His affliction could not fail to excite the displeasure of Brunhilde. "Why dost thou lament so fondly," said she, "for these little ones? What satisfaction could such unformed beings yield to thee? Unless thou wert still attached to their mother? Thy heart, then, is still hers? Or dost thou now regret her and them, because thou art satiated with my fondness, and weary of my endearments? Had these young ones grown up, would they not have attached thee, thy spirit, and thy affections more closely to this earth of clay, to this dust, and have alienated thee from that sphere to which I, who have already passed the grave, endeavour to raise thee? Say, is thy spirit so heavy, or thy love so weak, or thy faith so hollow, that the hope of being mine forever is unable to touch thee? Thus did Brunhilde express her indignation at her consort's grief, and forbade him her presence. The fear of offending her beyond forgiveness, and his anxiety to appease her, soon dried up his tears, and he again abandoned himself to his fatal passion, until, approaching destruction, at length awakened him from his delusion. Neither maiden nor youth was any longer to be seen, either within the dreary walls of the castle or the adjoining territory. All had disappeared, for those whom the grave had not swallowed up had fled from the region of death. Who, therefore, now remained to quench the horrible thirst of the female vampire, save Walter himself? And his death she dared to contemplate unmoved, for that divine sentiment that unites two beings in one joy and one sorrow was unknown to her bosom. Was he in his tomb, so was she free to search out other victims and glut herself with destruction, until she herself should at the last day be consumed with the earth itself. Such is the fatal law to which the dead are subject when awoke by the arts of necromancy from the sleep of the grave. She now began to fix her bloodthirsty lips on Walter's breast, when, cast into a profound sleep by the odour of her violet breath, he reclined beside her, quite unconscious of his impending fate. Yet soon did his vital powers begin to decay, and many a grey hair peeped through his raven locks. With his strength, his passion also declined, and he now frequently left her in order to pass the whole day in the sports of the chase, hoping thereby to regain his wonted vigour. As he was reposing one day in a wood beneath the shade of an oak, he perceived on the summit of a tree a bird of strange appearance and quite unknown to him. But before he could take aim at it with his bow, it flew away into the clouds, at the same time letting fall a rose-coloured root which dropped at Walter's feet, who immediately took it up, and, although he was well acquainted with almost every plant, he could not remember to have seen any at all resembling this. Its delightfully odoriferous scent induced him to try its flavour, but 10 times more bitter than wormwood it was, even as gall in his mouth, upon which, impatient of the disappointment, he flung it away with violence. Had he, however, been aware of its miraculous quality, and that it acted as a counter-charm against the opiate perfume of Brunhilde's breath, he would have blessed it, in spite of its bitterness. Thus do mortals often blindly cast away in displeasure the unsavoury remedy that would otherwise work their weal. When Walter returned home in the evening and laid him down to repose as usual by Brunhilde's side, the magic power of her breath produced no effect upon him, and for the first time during many months did he close his eyes in a natural slumber. Yet hardly had he fallen asleep ere a pungent, smarting pain disturbed him from his dreams, and, opening his eyes, he discerned by the gloomy rays of a lamp that glimmered in the apartment what for some moments transfixed him quite aghast. For it was Brunhilde, drawing with her lips the warm blood from his bosom. The wild cry of horror which at length escaped him terrified Brunhilde, whose mouth was besmeared with the warm blood. "Monster!" exclaimed he, springing from the couch. "Is it thus that you love me?" "Aye, even as the dead love," replied she with a malignant coldness. "Creature of blood," continued Walter, "the delusion which has so long blinded me is at an end. Thou art the fiend who hast destroyed my children, who hast murdered the offspring of my vassals." Raising herself upwards, and at the same time casting on him a glance that froze him to the spot with dread, she replied, "It is not I who have murdered them. I was obliged to pamper myself with warm, youthful blood in order that I might satisfy thy furious desires. Thou art the murderer." These dreadful words summoned before Walter's terrified conscience the threatening shades of all those who had thus perished, while despair choked his voice. "Why," continued she, in a tone that increased his horror, "why dost thou make mouths at me like a puppet? Thou who hadst the courage to love the dead, to take into thy bed one who had been sleeping in the grave, the bedfellow of the worm, who hast clasped in thy lustful arms the corruption of the tomb. Dost thou, unhallowed as thou art, now raise this hideous cry for the sacrifice of a few lives? They are but leaves swept from their branches by a storm. Come, chase these idiot fancies, and taste the bliss thou hast so dearly purchased." So saying, she extended her arms towards him. But this motion served only to increase his terror, and, exclaiming, "Accursed being," he rushed out of the apartment. End of Part 2 of Wake Not the Dead. Recording by Louise J. Bell. Part 3 of Wake Not the Dead. All the horrors of a guilty, upbraiding conscience became his companions, now that he was awakened from the delirium of his unholy pleasures. Frequently did he curse his own obstinate blindness, for having given no heed to the hints and admonitions of his children's nurses, but treating them as vile calumnies. But his sorrow was now too late, for although repentance may gain pardon for the sinner, it cannot alter the immutable decrees of fate. It cannot recall the murdered from the tomb. No sooner did the first break of dawn appear than he set out for his lonely castle in the mountains, determined no longer to abide under the same roof with so terrific a being. Yet vain was his flight, for on waking the following morning, he perceived himself in Brunhilde's arms, and quite entangled in her long raven tresses, which seemed to involve him and bind him in the fetters of his fate. The powerful fascination of her breath held him still more captivated, so that, forgetting all that had passed, he returned her caresses, until, awakening as from a dream, he recoiled in unmixed horror from her embrace. During the day he wandered through the solitary wilds of the mountains, as a culprit seeking an asylum from his pursuers, and at night retired to the shelter of a cave, fearing less to couch himself within such a dreary place than to expose himself to the horror of again meeting Brunhilde. But, alas, it was in vain that he endeavored to flee her. Again, when he awoke, he found her the partner of his miserable bed. Nay, had he sought the center of the earth as his hiding place, had he even embedded himself beneath rocks, or formed his chamber in the recesses of the ocean, still had he found her his constant companion. For, by calling her again into existence, he had rendered himself inseparably hers. So fatal were the links that united them. Struggling with the madness that was beginning to seize him, and brooding incessantly on the ghastly visions that presented themselves to his horror-stricken mind, he lay motionless in the gloomiest recesses of the woods, even from the rise of sun till the shades of eve. But no sooner was the light of day extinguished in the west, and the woods buried in impenetrable darkness, than the apprehension of resigning himself to sleep drove him forth among the mountains. The storm played wildly with the fantastic clouds and with the rattling leaves as they were caught up into the air, as if some dread spirit was sporting with these images of transitoriness and decay. It roared among the summits of the oaks, as if uttering a voice of fury, while its hollow sound, rebounding among the distant hills, seemed as the moans of a departing sinner, or as the faint cry of some wretch expiring under the murderer's hand. The owl, too, uttered its ghastly cry, as if foreboding the wreck of nature. Walter's hair flew disorderly in the wind, like black snakes wreathing around his temples and shoulders, while each sense was awake to catch fresh horror. In the clouds he seemed to behold the forms of the murdered, in the howling wind to hear their laments and groans. In the chilling blast itself he felt the dire kiss of Brunhilde. In the cry of the screeching bird he heard her voice. In the mouldering leaves he scented the charnel bed out of which he had awakened her. "Murderer of thy own offspring," exclaimed he in a voice making night and the conflict of the elements still more hideous. "Paramour of a bloodthirsty vampire, reveller with the corruption of the tomb," while in his despair he rent the wild locks from his head. Just then the full moon darted from beneath the bursting clouds, and the sight recalled to his remembrance the advice of the sorcerer, when he trembled at the first apparition of Brunhilde rising from her sleep of death. namely, to seek him at the season of the full moon, in the mountains, where 3 roads met. Scarcely had this gleam of hope broke in on his bewildered mind than he flew to the appointed spot. On his arrival, Walter found the old man seated there upon a stone, as calmly as though it had been a bright sunny day, and completely regardless of the uproar around. "Art thou come, then?" exclaimed he to the breathless wretch, who, flinging himself at his feet, cried in a tone of anguish, "Oh, save me! Succor me! Rescue me from the monster that scattereth death and desolation around her! Wherefore a mysterious warning? Why didst thou not rather disclose to me at once all the horrors that awaited my sacrilegious profanation of the grave?" "And wherefore a mysterious warning? Why didst thou not perceivest how wholesome was the advice? Wake not the dead. Wert thou able to listen to another voice than that of thy impetuous passions? Did not thy eager impatience shut my mouth at the very moment I would have cautioned thee?" True, true. Thy reproof is just. But what does it avail now? I need the promptest aid. "Well," replied the old man, "there remains even yet a means of rescuing thyself, but it is fraught with horror and demands all thy resolution." "Utter it then, utter it, for what can be more appalling, more hideous than the misery I now endure?" "Know, then," continued the sorcerer, "that only on the night of the new moon does she sleep the sleep of mortals, and then all the supernatural power which she inherits from the grave totally fails her. 'Tis then that thou must murder her." "How murder her?" echoed Walter. "Aye," returned the old man calmly. "Pierce her bosom with a sharpened dagger, which I will furnish thee with. At the same time, renounce her memory forever, swearing never to think of her intentionally, and that, if thou dost involuntarily, thou wilt repeat the curse." Most horrible. Yet what can be more horrible than she herself is? I'll do it. Keep, then, this resolution until the next new moon. "What? Must I wait until then?" cried Walter. "Alas, ere then, either her savage thirst for blood will have forced me into the night of the tomb, or horror will have driven me into the night of madness." "Nay," replied the sorcerer, "that I can prevent." And, so saying, he conducted him to a cavern further among the mountains. "Abide here twice 7 days," said he. "So long can I protect thee against her deadly caresses. Here wilt thou find all due provision for thy wants. But take heed that nothing tempt thee to quit this place. Farewell. When the moon renews itself, then do I repair hither again." So saying, the sorcerer drew a magic circle around the cave, and then immediately disappeared. Twice 7 days did Walter continue in this solitude, where his companions were his own terrifying thoughts and his bitter repentance. The present was all desolation and dread. The future presented the image of a horrible deed which he must perforce commit, while the past was empoisoned by the memory of his guilt. Did he think on his former happy union with Brünnhilde, her horrible image presented itself to his imagination, with her lips defiled with dropping blood. Or did he call to mind the peaceful days he had passed with Svanhilde? He beheld her sorrowful spirit, with the shadows of her murdered children. Such were the horrors that attended him by day. Those of night were still more dreadful, for then he beheld Brünnhilde herself, who, wandering round the magic circle which she could not pass, called upon his name till the cavern re-echoed the horrible sound. "Walter, my beloved," cried she, "wherefore dost thou avoid me? Art thou not mine, forever mine? Mine here and mine hereafter? And dost thou seek to murder me? Ah, commit not a deed which hurls us both to perdition, thyself as well as me." In this manner did the horrible visitant torment him each night, and, even when she departed, robbed him of all repose. The night of the new moon at length arrived, dark as the deed it was doomed to bring forth. The sorcerer entered the cavern. "Come," said he to Walter, "let us depart hence. The hour is now arrived." And he forthwith conducted him in silence from the cave to a coal-black steed, the sight of which recalled to Walter's remembrance the fatal night. He then related to the old man Brünnhilde's nocturnal visits, and anxiously inquired whether her apprehensions of eternal perdition would be fulfilled or not. "Mortal eye," exclaimed the sorcerer, "may not pierce the dark secrets of another world, or penetrate the deep abyss that separates earth from heaven." Walter hesitated to mount the steed. "Be resolute," exclaimed his companion. "But this once is it granted to thee to make the trial. And should thou fail now, naught can rescue thee from her power." "What can be more horrible than she herself? I am determined." And he leapt upon the horse, the sorcerer mounting also behind him. Carried with a rapidity equal to that of the storm that sweeps across the plain, they, in brief space, arrived at Walter's castle. All the doors flew open at the bidding of his companion, and they speedily reached Brünnhilde's chamber and stood beside her couch. Reclining in a tranquil slumber, she reposed in all her native loveliness. Every trace of horror had disappeared from her countenance. She looked so pure, meek, and innocent that all the sweet hours of their endearments rushed to Walter's memory like interceding angels pleading in her behalf. His unnerved hand could not take the dagger which the sorcerer presented to him. "The blow must be struck even now," said the latter. "Shouldst thou delay but an hour, She will lie at daybreak on thy bosom, sucking the warm life drops from thy heart. Horrible, most horrible, faltered the trembling Walter. And, turning away his face, he thrust the dagger into her bosom, exclaiming, "I curse thee forever!" And the cold blood gushed upon his hand. Opening her eyes once more, she cast a look of ghastly horror on her husband, and, in a hollow, dying accent, said, "Thou too art doomed to perdition. Lay now thy hand upon her corpse," said the sorcerer, "and swear the oath." Walter did as commanded, saying, "Never will I think of her with love, never recall her to mind intentionally, and should her image recur to my mind involuntarily, so will I exclaim to it, 'Be thou accursed.' Thou hast now done everything," returned the sorcerer. "Restore her therefore to the earth, from which thou didst so foolishly recall her, and be sure to recollect thy oath, for shouldst thou forget it but once, she would return, and thou wouldst be inevitably lost. Adieu. We see each other no more." Having uttered these words, he quitted the apartment, and Walter also fled from this abode of horror, having first given direction that the corpse should be speedily interred. Again did the terrific Brunhilde repose within her grave, but her image continually haunted Walter's imagination, so that his existence was one continued martyrdom, in which he continually struggled to dismiss from his recollection the hideous phantoms of the past. Yet, the stronger his effort to banish them, so much the more frequently and the more vividly did they return, as the night wanderer who is enticed by a fire-wisp into quagmire or bog sinks the deeper into his damp grave, the more he struggles to escape. His imagination seemed incapable of admitting any other image than that of Brunhilde. Now he fancied he beheld her expiring, the blood streaming from her beautiful bosom. At others, he saw the lovely bride of his youth, who reproached him with having disturbed the slumbers of the tomb. And to both he was compelled to utter the dreadful words, "I curse thee forever." The terrible imprecation was constantly passing his lips, yet was he in incessant terror lest he should forget it, or dream of her without being able to repeat it, and then on awaking find himself in her arms. Else would he recall her expiring words, and, appalled at their terrific import, imagine that the doom of his perdition was irrecoverably past. Whence should he fly from himself? Or how erase from his brain these images and forms of horror? In the din of combat, in the tumult of war and its incessant pour of victory to defeat, from the cry of anguish to the exultation of victory, in these he hoped to find, at least, the relief of distraction. But here, too, he was disappointed. The giant fang of apprehension now seized him who had never before known fear. Each drop of blood that sprayed upon him seemed the cold blood that had gushed from Brunhilde's wound. Each dying wretch that fell beside him looked like her, when, expiring, she exclaimed, "Thou too art doomed to perdition," so that the aspect of death seemed more full of dread to him than aught beside, and this unconquerable terror compelled him to abandon the battlefield. At length, after many a weary and fruitless wandering, he returned to his castle. Here all was deserted and silent, as if the sword, or a still more deadly pestilence, had laid everything waste. For the few inhabitants that still remained, and even those servants who had once shown themselves the most attached, now fled from him, as though he had been branded with the mark of Cain. With horror he perceived that, by uniting himself as he had done with the dead, he had cut himself off from the living, who refused to hold any intercourse with him. Often, when he stood on the battlements of his castle and looked down upon desolate fields, he compared their present solitude with the lively activity they were wont to exhibit under the strict but benevolent discipline of Svanhilda. He now felt that she alone could reconcile him to life. But durst he hope that one whom he so deeply aggrieved could pardon him and receive him again? Impatience at length got the better of fear. He sought Svanhilda, and with the deepest contrition acknowledged his complicated guilt. Embracing her knees as he beseeched her to pardon him and to return to his desolate castle, in order that it might again become the abode of contentment and peace. The pale form which she beheld at her feet, the shadow of the lately blooming youth, touched Svanhilda. "The folly," said she gently, "though it has caused me much sorrow, has never excited my resentment or my anger. But say, where are my children?" To this dreadful interrogation, the agonized father could for a while frame no reply. At length, he was obliged to confess the dreadful truth. "Then we are sundered forever," returned Svanhilda. Nor could all his tears or supplications prevail upon her to revoke the sentence she had given. Stripped of his last earthly hope, bereft of his last consolation, and thereby rendered as poor as mortal can possibly be on this side of the grave, Walter returned homewards. When, as he was riding through the forest in the neighborhood of his castle, absorbed in his gloomy meditations, the sudden sound of a horn roused him from his reverie. Shortly after, he saw appear a female figure clad in black and mounted on a steed of the same color. Her attire was like that of a huntress, but instead of a falcon, she bore a raven in her hand, and she was attended by a gay troop of cavaliers and dames. The first salutations being past, he found that she was proceeding the same road as himself. And when she found that Walter's castle was close at hand, she requested that he would lodge her for that night, the evening being far advanced. Most willingly did he comply with this request, since the appearance of the beautiful stranger had struck him greatly. So wonderfully did she resemble Svanhilda, except that her locks were brown and her eye dark and full of fire. With a sumptuous banquet did he entertain his guests, whose mirth and songs enlivened the lately silent halls. 3 days did this revelry continue, and so exhilarating did it prove to Walter that he seemed to have forgotten his sorrows and his fears. Nor could he prevail upon himself to dismiss his visitors, dreading lest on their departure the castle would seem 100 times more desolate than before, and his grief be proportionally increased. At his earnest request, the stranger consented to stay 7, and again another 7 days. Without being requested, she took upon herself the superintendence of the household, which she regulated as discreetly and cheerfully as Svanhilda had been wont to do, so that the castle, which had so lately been the abode of melancholy and horror, became the residence of pleasure and festivity, and Walter's grief disappeared altogether in the midst of so much gaiety. Daily did his attachment to the fair unknown increase. He even made her his confidant, and one evening, as they were walking together apart from any of her train, he related to her his melancholy and frightful history. "My dear friend," returned she, as soon as he had finished his tale, "it ill beseems a man of thy discretion to afflict thyself on account of all this. Thou hast awakened the dead from the sleep of the grave, and afterwards found, what might have been anticipated, that the dead possess no sympathy with life. What then? Thou wilt not commit this error a second time. Thou hast, however, murdered the being whom thou hadst thus recalled again to existence. But it was only in appearance, for thou couldst not deprive that of life which properly had none. Thou hast, too, lost a wife and 2 children, but at thy years such a loss is most easily repaired. There are beauties who will gladly share thy couch, and make thee again a father. But thou dreadst the reckoning of hereafter. Go, open the graves, and ask the sleepers there whether that hereafter disturbs them." In such manner would she frequently exhort and cheer him, so that in a short time his melancholy entirely disappeared. He now ventured to declare to the unknown the passion with which she had inspired him, nor did she refuse him her hand. Within 7 days afterwards, the nuptials were celebrated, and the very foundations of the castle seemed to rock from the wild, tumultuous uproar of unrestrained riot. The wine streamed in abundance, the goblets circled incessantly. Intemperance reached its utmost bounds, while shouts of laughter almost resembling madness burst from the numerous train belonging to the unknown. At length, Walter, heated with wine and love, conducted his bride into the nuptial chamber. But oh, horror! Scarcely had he clasped her in his arms ere she transformed herself into a monstrous serpent, which, entwining him in its horrid folds, crushed him to death. Flames crackled on every side of the apartment. In a few minutes after, the whole castle was enveloped in a blaze that consumed it entirely. while, as the walls fell in with a tremendous crash, a voice exclaimed aloud, "Wake not the dead." End of Part 3. End of Wake Not the Dead.